Okay, so we left off on page 29, uh, and we were to say this anarchy uh, continues to exert its will even after God comes into existence. And right, I just want to go over this passage again. Again, I think we can hear the echo of Hesiod's chaos and anarchy, Schelling's word anarchy. And I want to just repeat this. Anarchy still lies in the ground as if it could break through once again. And nowhere does it appear as if order and form were what is original, but rather as if initial anarchy had been brought to order. This is the incomprehensible base of reality. Anarchy still lies in the ground as if it could break through. As if anarchy could overtake God and order, right? And this, as if this appearance that it could break through, is because everywhere it appears as if order and form uh, were what came after anarchy. Nowhere does it appear as if order and form were what is original. It does not appear that order is original, but rather as if order is brought into anarchy. So this is the incomprehensible base of reality. I think the suggestion is this anarchy, the will of the ground, and the anarchy of that will doesn't actually have the capacity to overpower God, but it appears as though it doesn't have the capacity to overpower God. Uh, and it appears as if it is the original, as if what comes first is anarchy. But this is part of this impossible sort of schema that Schelling is devising here. That in fact the anarchy, the ground of God's existence, is ultimately not what is first, because it is for the sake of God's order and existence that the anarchy comes into existence. The anarchy exists uh, in order for God to overcome it. God gives a ground for his existence so as to overcome it. Um, Order is still uh, primary here. But this independent anarchy must be independent and must appear to be original and appear as though it could break through the order, uh, so that God is able to demonstrate the superior power of his existence. And we get some sense of why this might be in the middle of this page, 29. We would know of nothing that could drive man more to strive for the light with all his strength than the consciousness of the deep from which he has been lifted into existence. Right? So the appearance that anarchy is primary, that the dark is first, rather than something that the light has prepared in order to break. Uh, the fact that anarchy appears as though it's first is part of um, this purpose of God's, Uh, and one of the ways it functions is to drive man to strive for the light, right? We strive for understanding because of our consciousness of the deep night, the darkness, the anarchy from out of which we arise. That is the ground for existence. So, our experience of uh, an original nothingness is um, is intentional uh, insofar as it is that which prompts us to seek order and understanding. And so this yearning uh, within us, human beings, as desire for understanding, desire for order. Uh, so the sort of paradox is that the anarchy solicits order, but that is uh, part of the intention of uh, the unity, which is God, that holds the ground in itself prior to its own existence. Right? Remember, God is something more than just an existence. God's being includes existence, but is more than existence. That's probably um, the most interesting idea so far. So let's look at page 30, where we get even deeper into this strange dynamic between ground and God's existence. He says, but corresponding to the yearning, which as the still dark ground is the first stirring of divine existence, an inner reflexive representation is generated in God Himself, through which, since it can have no other object but God, God sees Himself. So, this yearning is the first stirring of divine existence, and is an inner reflexive representation, right? Uh, Corresponding to this yearning, an inner reflexive representation is generated. As the yearning yearns, there is a corresponding inner uh, act, a reflexive representation, right? Uh, in God Himself. God represents Himself. What is existence? A representation of God born from the stirring of this yearning. Uh, and it is through this reflexive representation, self representation, uh, through which God sees Himself. Again, God reveals Himself to Himself. The ground uh, allows God to present a representation of Himself to Himself. Uh, Again, representation meaning thinking, meaning a certain kind of ideal. He goes on, this representation is with God in the beginning and is the God who is begotten in God Himself. Is the God who was begotten in God Himself. Representation is not God. Existing God is uh, not God qua God. God qua representation of God. This representation is at the same time the understanding. Right? So uh, it is this representation of God to himself, stirred by the yearning, that is the beginning of the understanding, an understanding which will has been solicited by the yearning and which will bring order to the yearning. This representation is at the same time the understanding, the word of this yearning. Right? What is understood is the yearning. God represents himself to himself uh, as this yearning. Um, and Schelling has a note here. This is the only correct dualism, namely that which at the same time permits a unity. Uh, so, is the representation of this yearning and the eternal spirit which, perceiving the world with perceiving the word within itself, at the same time the infinite yearning, and impelled by the love that it itself is, proclaims the word, so that the understanding and yearning together now become a freely creating and all powerful will, and build in the initial anarchy of nature as in its own element or instrument. So, the representation of this yearning uh, and the eternal spirit, this is an important word, which, perceiving the word within it, and at the same time the infinite yearning, right? So, in the moment in which God comes into existence as a self representation, we simultaneously get the advent of understanding, which Schelling calls the word, the understanding of this yearning. God, God's representation of himself is an understanding of the yearning, of the ground, and the eternal spirit, which, perceiving the word within itself, right? Understanding, this representation perceives not just the yearning, uh, but also the eternal spirit, and in that unity perceives the word that is order within itself. Uh, Perceiving the word, perceiving this understanding. Uh, the understanding proclaims the word, acts. The understanding acts. It speaks. It proclaims the word. It proclaims order. It compels the understanding to assert this order and proclaim the word. It says, impelled by the love that it itself is. So God's very nature uh, is love, and it is love that proclaims the word so that the understanding and yearning together now become a freely creating and all powerful will. So, self representation gives understanding, which, impelled by the love that it is, proclaims uh, the unity of understanding and yearning, which together in this unity, this dualism that still permits a unity, creates a freely creating and all powerful will, which builds in the initial anarchy of nature as in its own element or instrument. And so anarchy becomes an instrument of love and of God's self representation, God's ability to reveal himself to himself. Uh, Now, I'm just going to keep important. The first effect of the understanding in nature is the division of forces. The understanding divides forces. And I think what he means by this is grants individuation to things, since only thus can the understanding unfold the unity that is unconsciously but necessarily immanent in nature as in a seed, just as in man the light enters into the dark, yearning to create something so that the chaotic jumble of thoughts all hang together, but each from emerging. Thoughts divide themselves from each other, and now the unity hidden in the ground and containing all raises itself up. So, the eternal ground for the existence of God must contain within itself, although locked up, the essence of God as a resplendent glimpse of life in the darkness of the depths. The ground is there to act as an instrument for God to reveal himself. It is the manner by which he's able to do so, and thus in the ground there is already, although locked up, not yet apparent, the resplendent glimpse of life. Uh, and he confirms that this first act of understanding is to give unity to individuals, to give independence to individuals, right? Because what is a unity is dependent on nothing else, is an individual. On 31, the forces split up in this division are the material from which the body is subsequently configured. The vital bond which arises in division, the vital bond that arises in division. Without division, there is no unity. The vital bond which arises in division, thus from the depths of the natural ground as the center of forces, is the soul. So, the bond which arises in division, this unity that requires complete division, is the soul, right? Our souls are individual. They are the vital bond of unity in an individual that is made possible by the division of forces, which is the first act of the understanding. So he says, continuing on 31, because the original understanding raises the soul up as something inner out of a ground that is independent of it. The soul thereby remains independent of the original understanding as a particular and self sufficient being. So, the understanding grants the soul, raises the soul up uh, as something inner, that is, something which has an inner unity from out of a ground that is independent of it, right? Another independent thing. And the soul thereby remains independent of the original understanding. Right? So the soul is independent. The soul has its own being. So he goes on to show how each succeeding process approaches closer to the essence of nature until the innermost center appears in the highest division of forces is the task of a comprehensive philosophy of nature. Right? Remember, this is Schelling's task, a true philosophy of nature. And what that entails is finding the innermost center at the highest division of forces. That is, what uh, unifies, what acts as ground and center for those things which are most separate and different from each other. Each being, having emerged in nature according to the manner indicated, has a dual principle in itself, which, however, is basically but one and the same considered from both possible sides. Uh, the first principle is that through which things are separated from God, or through which they exist in the mere ground. It is uh, as having arisen from the ground, our identity with the ground, the principle of the ground within us, that is to say, the yearning within us, uh, that separates us from God, that separates us from pure understanding. Uh, since, however, the original unity indeed occurs between what is in the ground and what is prefigured in the understanding, and the process of creation involves only an inner transmutation or transfiguration of the initial principle of darkness into light. The dark principle is exactly what is transfigured in the light, and both are, but only to a certain point, one in each natural being. So, dual principles. And again, I think we can think of Plotinus here. The principle, to the extent that it comes from the ground and is dark, is the self will of creatures. Right? The principle in us that belongs to the ground is our self will, our selfishness, our yearning for ourselves. Uh, self will of creatures, which, however, to the extent that it has not yet been raised to complete unity, light as principle of understanding, is pure craving or desire, that is, blind will. So Schelling will say the self will, which is attached to the principle of darkness and ground, will be what governs all animals. It's instinct. It is their independence, and that independence is only found through its connection to the independence of the ground, its separability from God by virtue of its its dark principle, right? The fact that it comes from the ground is will. instinct. The understanding as universal will stands against this self-will of creatures, using and subordinating the latter to itself as a mere instrument. Again, right, this self-will is subordinate to the understanding, to God's existence, and that self-will is again an instrument understanding to reveal itself. Uh, Now, this explains the independence of animals in nature. You might say that there is a kind of freedom, but a blind freedom granted to animals in that the self will is indeed independent. He goes on. But if through advancing mutation and division of all forces, the deepest and most inner point of initial darkness in a being is finally transfigured wholly into the light, that is to say, if understanding conquers the darkness, understanding grasps its ground entirely, then the will of this same being is indeed, to the extent it is individual, also a truly particular will. Particular meaning a will having personality. Not a blind will, but a will that has a different degree of choice. Yet, in itself, or as the centrum of all other particular wills, one with the primal will or the understanding. So that now from both a single whole comes into being. So that now from both a single whole comes into being. Right? So uh, when this ground is grasped by the understanding sufficiently, right, through advanced mutation, the more anarchy is grasped by the understanding, the more enlightened a being becomes. It develops personality. And in this personality, what is there is a certain degree of understanding, but not complete understanding. And thus, understanding and ground remain separate. And they're separate, their separate independence form a single whole. This raising of the deepest centrum into light occurs in none of the creatures visible to us other than man. In man, there is the whole power of the dark principle, and at the same time, the whole strength of the light. Man has sufficient understanding to grasp the dual principles, the anarchy and the light. In him, there is the deepest abyss and the loftiest sky, or both centra. Right? Both are there. Human will is the seed hidden in eternal yearning of the God who is present still in the ground only. Okay. Uh, Now, he goes on. Because he emerges from the ground, is creaturely, man has in relation to God a relatively independent principle in himself. But because precisely this principle, without it ceasing for that reason to be dark in accordance with its ground, is transfigured in light. Because the ground achieves a higher degree of understanding in the human, there arises in him something higher, spirit. Humans are the only beings that have spirit, and spirit is the consciousness of both the abyssal anarchy of the ground, which is kind of non-existence, and consciousness of God, of the higher, um, of the word and the order. And this spirit is going to be the ultimate possibility of evil. Right? The same unity that is inseverable in God, right? Because for God, the ground is grasped entirely by the understanding. Uh, Ground cannot be severed from understanding. Right? The eternal abyss, the darkness, makes sense completely to God, is understood entirely, and thus there is no separation between uh, anarchic ground and principles of understanding in God. The same unity that is inseverable in God must therefore be severable in man. Man is able to separate these two principles because the understanding doesn't grasp the ground in its entirety, and therefore they remain entirely independent. So the severability of these two principles, a spirit in which ground and word, light and dark, are not perfectly unified, uh, is the spirit of man, not the spirit of God. He goes on. This is the possibility of good and evil. It is the existence of this duality that allows us to grasp, that allows us to conceive of good and evil, and which ultimately will give us a different kind of freedom. All right, so we will pause again for today.